It was the bell that first drew me out that morning, a thin, reluctant sound, the kind that wavers between duty and disuse. St. Giles had always been a modest church, more admired for its endurance than its beauty, and the bell had not been rung for years. Yet that day, through a pale mist rising off the Banbury Road, I heard it, dull, deliberate, and curiously unceremonious. I had no intention of attending the funeral. There are few things less suited to my temperament than ceremony, and fewer still that can excuse a man's absence of genuine feeling. I stood instead at the far end of the street, watching as the mourners slipped like grey moths through the churchyard gate. I recognized none of them, except for a woman in a dark blue coat. Too elegant for the occasion, too composed. Someone told me later that she was Evelyn Crichton, widow of the late Professor Lionel Crichton of St. Olave's College, a name that sounded faintly familiar, as if once encountered in the margin of an old examination paper or beneath a footnote about Greek inscriptions. The Times that morning had printed the announcement, Professor Lionel Crichton, aged 63, died peacefully at his home near St. Giles, beloved husband of Evelyn. The phrasing irritated me. Peaceful deaths are rarely peaceful. They simply occur beyond the reach of contradiction. I remember folding the page, setting it beside my half-finished crossword, and wondering whether the clue for atonement, 8 letters, might not be better answered by confession. It often is. Rain had begun to fall, the sort that leaves no sound but changes the air entirely. I walked toward the Randolph, thinking of coffee but settling inevitably for whiskey. The bar was nearly empty. A young man with a rust-colored scarf asked if I'd been at the service. I told him no, though I had heard it. He nodded with the faint satisfaction of the curious. He'd been Crichton's student once, he said. A decent man, though distant. Brilliant with texts, hopeless with people. I remember thinking that the description could fit half of Oxford. He spoke of a final lecture, half attended, full of bitterness about mistranslations and false attributions. He said someone had stolen his words, the young man murmured. Imagine that, a scholar robbed of his language. When I looked up, he had already gone, leaving behind a small wet circle on the counter where his glass had been. Back in my rooms, I found myself leafing through the Oxford Gazette, where an older notice about Crichton appeared. A debate over a paper on the epitaphs of Corinth. The argument concerned a single word, eleos, meaning mercy or pity, depending on context. Crichton had insisted on mercy. His opponent, a younger lecturer, argued for pity. A trifling academic quibble, one might think. Yet the difference between those two words could alter the tone of an entire life. I wrote it down in my notebook, mercy or pity, and drew a small line beneath. Not as a clue, only a question. The day thinned into evening. The streets of Oxford gleamed like wet slate, and the sound of the bell, now faint with distance, seemed to linger somewhere in the marrow rather than the air. I passed St. Giles once more on my way home. The gate stood ajar. A wreath had fallen sideways into the gravel. Through the open door I glimpsed the widow, still seated alone in the pew, her hands clasped, her head bowed not in prayer but in calculation, the stillness of someone arranging her thoughts rather than offering them. Something about her composure disturbed me. There was no visible grief, only precision, as though the act of mourning required careful editing before submission. I've seen that look before, on the faces of men preparing alibis. It is not insincerity, but control, and control, when absolute, is almost always compensatory. When the verger approached, I asked quietly whether Professor Crichton had indeed died at home. He hesitated, then nodded. Heart failure, he said. Sudden, but not unexpected. He added that the professor had been reading late, as usual, with a decanter of claret and a notebook filled with half-finished quotations. A line from Sophocles lay open beside him. None loves life like him that loses it. I went back to my flat, poured another measure, and finished the crossword. The clue for atonement turned out to be redemption. I preferred my answer. Somewhere outside, the rain eased into mist again, and the bell of St. Giles fell silent. Looking back, I realized the case began not with a death, but with a sound, a hesitant toll marking the distance between pity and mercy, between truth and its more acceptable translation. That was the morning the widow of St. Giles entered my thoughts, and from there, she never quite left. I had not intended to see her again so soon. Curiosity, though, has always been my least manageable vice. That and the illusion that logic can illuminate emotion. Both have failed me often enough, yet still I persist. It was Lewis who suggested we call on her. There had been nothing formally suspicious about Crichton's death, but the pathologist's note, a minor inconsistency in timing barely worth ink, lingered in my mind like the aftertaste of a poorly chosen wine. So I agreed. I wanted to hear her speak, if only to confirm the tone of what I'd already imagined. Evelyn Crichton received us at 4:15, the precise hour when light begins to falter but refuses to yield. Her house on St. John Street was immaculate, a harmony of beige and absence. The air smelled faintly of polish and withheld sentiment. She met us with a smile that seemed, at first glance, kind, but it was the sort of kindness that asks for no reply. She offered tea, poured it herself. Lewis, ever cautious with his spoon, stirred as though it might betray him. I watched her hands, unhurried, slender, detached. They were the hands of someone accustomed to turning pages rather than touching people. She asked whether the police needed anything further for the inquest. I told her not yet, that I merely wanted a clearer picture of her husband's final evening. She paused a moment as if searching for the least dangerous memory. Then she said he had spent it reading as usual, in the upstairs study. She had retired early. He preferred solitude. There was nothing remarkable, she added. A quiet night, a quiet end. I asked what he had been reading. She thought for a moment, then replied, Sophocles. Oedipus at Colonus. The answer came too quickly, like a line rehearsed. I noted it silently, the way one notes an inflection in a sermon that jars against the rest. Lewis inquired about the professor's health. She answered that he had been frail lately, but not ill. He had always carried his anxieties in his chest. The phrasing interested me. Not his heart, but his anxieties. I wondered whether she spoke of worry or guilt. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece. Not of Lionel, but of a younger man. I asked, almost idly, whether it was a relative. She said it was a student of her husband's, taken years ago during some departmental trip to Delphi. Her tone suggested that the memory belonged more to her than to the professor. When we rose to leave, I noticed a letter half hidden under a silver paperweight shaped like an owl. A small thing, but I'm drawn to such incongruities. The owl, symbol of wisdom, pressed down upon words yet unread. A scholar's house might overflow with papers, but this one letter lay alone, unfiled. She noticed my glance and moved her hand slightly, a gesture so measured it almost erased itself. I pretended not to have seen. At the door she thanked us with the same faint smile, though now it seemed to tighten rather than warm. She said she hoped the inquest would be swift, that her husband had suffered enough from scrutiny while alive. The remark might have been defensive or merely weary, but it told me that she viewed questions not as tools of understanding, but as weapons. Outside, the rain had returned, thin, almost courteous. Lewis asked whether I thought she was lying. I said no, not lying. Editing, perhaps. Some truths, I told him, are too delicate to survive their own recital. We walked in silence back toward the station. the street lamps winking through mist. I kept seeing her smile, not its charm, but its precision. It was the kind of expression that conceals the arithmetic of emotion, a calculation performed behind the eyes. That evening, I returned to my flat and took out the day's crossword. The clue that caught me was expression that hides intent. 6 letters. The answer was smile. I almost laughed. I poured a measure of Glenfiddich, let it breathe. My mind kept circling the room we'd left behind. The unsent letter, the untroubled calm, the absence of grief where some semblance of it should have been. Recalled her saying that Lionel had died surrounded by his books. A comfortable fiction, perhaps. Books are better company in memory than in life. When I closed my eyes, I saw again her face in that dim, diffused light, neither mourning nor relief, something in between, a quiet acknowledgement that the world had, at last, arranged itself into her favor. The widow's smile. There was meaning in it somewhere, waiting beneath the surface, like the second answer to a clue that fits equally well but changes everything once seen. The postmark was smudged, as if embarrassed to bear the weight of time. It had been Lewis who found it, tucked among a stack of irrelevant correspondence in the late professor's study. A single sheet folded inside an addressed envelope, the flap never sealed. The ink was faint, the handwriting precise but uncertain, as though each word had been weighed and found slightly wanting. I remember sitting in that narrow room with its uneven floorboards and smell of old vellum, rain whispering against the window panes. There was a kind of polite silence that always follows a death in Oxford. The hush of scholars pretending their own turn will come with more dignity. Lewis handed me the letter as one might hand over evidence of doubt itself. It was addressed to the editor, the Journal of Classical Studies, though what it contained was not scholarship, but surrender. Crichton had written that he wished to withdraw his forthcoming paper on the Corinthian inscriptions. No reason given, only the curious line. The inscription was never meant to be public. A phrase that clung to me all afternoon. I've learned that when a man of letters avoids explanation, it is because he is hiding not ignorance, but pain. The paperweight on the desk, a bronze miniature of Athena, pressed against a small wine stain shaped almost like a question mark. The sort of imperfection that pleases the inattentive and troubles the observant. There were no other drafts, no copies on the typewriter. A scholar, meticulous to the point of mania, would not have left the matter so incomplete unless he feared where completion might lead. Lewis thought it might be professional embarrassment. A citation gone wrong, a mistranslation. I doubted it. Crichton's reputation had survived far worse. There had been whispers years ago of a misattributed discovery, some petty academic feud involving a student, but Oxford thrives on such minor scandals. It was the private tone of the letter that unsettled me. It read like confession disguised as correction. I sat in Crichton's chair for a while, letting the room tell me what it could. The books were aligned too neatly, the surfaces too recently dusted. Grief rarely polishes. It neglects. Someone had cared about appearances. On the side table lay a single glass. No decanter, just the faint scent of claret lingering in the air. Evelyn's hand, perhaps, tidying away the rest. I asked Lewis whether he had noticed any signs of illness. He said none were listed in the medical file. Mild hypertension, little else. Then he added, almost apologetically, that the neighbor had seen a man leaving the house the night Crichton died. Not a visitor known to them, a shape under a street lamp, no more. It might have meant nothing. It rarely does, until it does. Back in my flat, I read the letter again under the yellow light of the desk lamp. The phrase "never meant to be public" caught me once more. It struck me that such words are rarely about inscriptions or manuscripts. They belong to secrets, to private histories polished into forgetfulness. I poured a small whiskey, half listening to the radio, muttering about a traffic diversion near the high street. My mind kept circling back to that phrase, like a bee trapped behind glass. I took up the day's crossword, the Times, naturally. The clue read, "Hidden meaning revealed when words are withdrawn, alterate." The answer came to me almost immediately. Erasure. I penciled it in, though it felt more like prophecy than pastime. There is something indecent about coincidence when it insists too loudly. The next morning, I visited the Bodleian, more out of instinct than reason. I asked the librarian whether any papers had recently been submitted or recalled by Lionel Crichton. She frowned, searched the ledger, and said there had been a request to remove an article from the current issue. Too late to do so, it had already gone to print. But, she added, there had been a note from his wife earlier that week, thanking them for their understanding. I did not ask what they were meant to understand. The phrasing alone was enough. On my way out, I paused beneath the rain-darkened colonnade. Across the street, through a veil of drizzle, I saw Evelyn Crichton standing outside a florist's window, her reflection doubled in the glass. One image holding flowers, the other looking away. I almost crossed to her, but didn't. Some questions require silence to answer themselves. Later, in my report, I noted the discovery of the unsent letter, the absence of a sealing mark, and the peculiar phrase concerning the inscription. But privately, in my notebook, I wrote something else entirely. The truth, too, can be withdrawn. Even now, years later, I can recall the feel of that paper between my fingers. Fragile, unfinished, unwilling to declare its meaning. The letter that wasn't sent, like the confession that wasn't spoken, remains one of Oxford's quietest crimes. Not of action, but of omission. There is a particular stillness in Oxford's libraries during winter. Not silence, exactly, but a kind of suspended listening. The old stones seem to lean inward, absorbing the faint scrape of a chair leg, the sigh of a turning page. I have always liked such places. They pretend to offer truth, yet conceal it with elegance. It was there, in that long, frost-bound afternoon, that I first spoke with Fiona Clare. She worked among manuscripts, a custodian of the brittle and forgotten. I had known her name from a conference program years earlier, when she and Lionel Crichton had co-authored a paper on the moral ambiguities of Euripides. I remembered the title because it had seemed, even then, autobiographical. She looked up as I entered, her expression composed, perhaps faintly annoyed. She had the kind of face that never revealed irritation except through precision. Her first words were about the cold. One could almost hear the winter pressing against the glass. I asked whether she had heard of Crichton's death. She said yes. The news had reached the library sooner than she wished. There was a pause, the sort that belongs to the living when they are not yet ready to discuss the dead. She told me he had been working on something new before he died, something he had not shared with her, though he had hinted that it concerned betrayal, or authorship, or both. She smiled faintly when she said it, as though those words were interchangeable. I asked whether they had quarrelled. She said scholars do not quarrel, they merely footnote one another with increasing cruelty. On her desk lay a folio, open to a fragment of an inscription from Corinth. The words were inked faintly, the translation beside it half finished. She explained that it was part of a long-standing argument, whether a phrase should be rendered as faith restored or faith denied. She said Crichton had taken the latter view, though privately he seemed less certain. She touched the edge of the paper with her fingertip, as if to steady herself. I noticed her hand tremble ever so slightly, then resume its poise. The air in the library was heavy with dust and old ink. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and reluctant. I remember thinking how Oxford always looked truer under snow, stripped of its brilliance, honest in its decay. Fiona asked whether I believed Lionel's death to be suspicious. I said I rarely believe anything until it ceases to be convenient not to. She gave a quiet laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small envelope pinned beneath a paperweight shaped like an Ionic capital. It was addressed in Evelyn Crichton's handwriting. I recognized it from the condolence letter she had sent to the coroner. Fiona saw my gaze and explained that it had arrived a week before the professor's death. A note of thanks for a reference letter he had written on her behalf years ago. Her tone was careful, rehearsed. I asked whether she had replied. She said no, there seemed no need. Later, in the Radcliffe Square, the snow lay thick enough to mute the bells. I stopped by a bookseller's window, pretending to study a row of used poetry volumes. In truth, I was thinking of what Fiona had said. Betrayal, authorship, and the slippage between them. Scholars live by citation, yet die by omission. Perhaps that was Lionel's sin, or hers, or both. That night I tried to piece it together in my notebook. An unsent letter, a widow too calm, a colleague too measured. Each detail on its own felt harmless. Together they began to form a pattern, faint as handwriting beneath erased ink. The crossword that evening offered a clue that amused me. Cold setting for warm secrets. 7 letters. I tried library, and it fit, though I couldn't help noticing how the plural would not. 1 library, 1 secret. Singular, precise. Before sleep I thought again of Fiona's trembling hand. Scholars pride themselves on control, yet the body always remembers what the mind edits away. She had mentioned that Crichton once accused a former student of plagiarism, a man named Merrow. But she had added, too casually, that Evelyn had once defended the boy. It was a small thing, easily forgotten. Yet later, when everything came apart, that was the moment I recalled most clearly. Fiona's fingertip on the paper, steadying a line that refused translation, and outside, the snow falling with the patience of someone waiting for a confession. There is something faintly cruel about photographs. They preserve the light and discard the air, capture the posture of a life, but none of its hesitation. I've always distrusted them. The living seldom resemble their photographs, and the dead resemble them too much. Lewis had brought it to me that morning in his usual unceremonious way, sliding the envelope across my desk as if delivering a bill. Found it in the archives at St. Olave's, he said. Faculty dinner, about 10 years ago. The classics department. The ink from his thumb left a faint print on the margin. Even fingerprints, I thought, are accidental confessions. I unfolded the photograph carefully. A long table, gleaming glasses, faces leaning toward one another in mid-conversation, the frozen mimicry of warmth. I recognized Lionel Crichton at once. Upright, eyes narrowed in that mixture of intellect and fatigue I'd seen too often among Oxford's senior men. Beside him, to my quiet astonishment, stood Evelyn. Younger, smiling in that deliberate, camera-trained way. But what caught me was the tilt of her body, not toward Lionel, but toward the man beside her. A tall figure, dark-haired, with the kind of face that suggests both promise and danger. Someone had scrawled names on the back: Crichton, Evelyn, Merrow, Claire, Dean. The name Merrow had been underlined twice. Julian Merrow, the same student who had once been accused of plagiarism, the same man now rumoured to have left Oxford under the faint cloud of disgrace that never quite dissipates in these parts. I remembered Fiona Clare's measured tone when she mentioned him. She had said Evelyn defended him once, though her voice had carried an extra weight on the word once. The photograph felt heavy in my hands, not for what it showed, but for what it implied. Affection is always easier to spot in retrospect. One learns to notice the half-turned shoulder, the e.g. shared angle of gaze, the body language of unfinished sentences. I asked Lewis to find out what became of Merrow. He returned after lunch with his usual economy of words. Lectured briefly in Edinburgh, then in Prague. Nothing since. Apparently hospitalized 2 weeks before Crichton's death. Heart trouble again. Oxford's irony never disappoints. That evening, I took the photograph home and laid it under the lamplight beside my whiskey. The room smelled faintly of paper and rain, the scent of all unfinished inquiries. I studied Evelyn's face. Not happiness, precisely, but recognition. That particular warmth between people who have already shared a secret and are remembering not to reveal it. I flipped the photograph over again. In the lower corner, barely visible, a reflection, a mirror on the far wall of the dining hall, capturing a blurred figure at the edge of the frame. A man half-turned, his features indistinct but familiar in outline. Not a guest, not one of the academics. Someone observing, not participating. I looked closer. It wasn't the image that startled me, but the posture. Arms folded, head tilted slightly as though waiting for something to conclude. I'd seen that posture once before, in a mirror opposite Evelyn's chair the day I first called on her. She had stood like that while pouring tea, steady and remote, as though she herself were a reflection someone else might study later. The deduction, if it was one, came not with excitement, but with the faint chill of inevitability. The photograph was not simply a memory. It was a map. Evelyn at its center, 2 men on either side. One she married, one she perhaps loved, both doomed by the same quiet precision that had guided her hand on the teapot. Lewis asked, later that week, whether I'd shown her the picture. I told him no. You don't show mirrors to those already reflected too deeply in their own past. But the image wouldn't leave me. It lingered at the edge of vision, like a tune remembered but never sung aloud. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that composition, the glass, the candles, the 3 faces bound by the invisible geometry of desire and disappointment. That night's crossword offered a clue that seemed to mock me. Truth in reflection, 5. I tried Myra before realizing my own error, added the missing R, and felt a foolish satisfaction at the symmetry. Reflection needs duplication. Truth, I suppose, does not. Before sleep, I placed the photograph in a drawer beside my notebook. I told myself it was only evidence, though I knew better. Evidence ends where imagination begins, and Oxford teaches one to live comfortably between the two. Years later, when I think of Evelyn Crichton, I think not of her composure or her intellect, but of that moment in silver halide. Her hand resting lightly on a man's sleeve, her eyes turned elsewhere, and the faint ghost in the mirror watching from the distance. The man in the photograph. The man no one remembered but me. The clue came not through confession or discovery, but through poetry, as it so often does in Oxford, where sentiment hides best beneath structure. It was Lewis who brought me the book, more out of duty than curiosity. A slim, battered volume of Greek elegies, its spine frayed, the professor's name penciled on the fly-leaf. He had found it among the papers cleared from Crichton's desk after the inquest. I had asked him to leave everything untouched, but tidiness is a vice that passes for virtue in the police force. The first thing I noticed was the annotation. Neat, deliberate, faintly obsessive. The kind of marginalia that suggests a man reading not for pleasure, but penance. I turned to the poem that bore the heaviest markings, a lament for lost truth, rendered in careful translation on the facing page. Beneath one verse, in Lionel Crichton's elegant hand, appeared a phrase, "Truth lies beneath affection." It struck me at once as wrong. The original Greek read more closely as love conceals what truth reveals. Subtle, but not identical. One implies deception, the other, preservation. I made a note of the change, a small lie hidden in the language of fidelity. When I visited Evelyn later that week, I asked whether she knew the book. She nodded, almost fondly. It had been Lionel's companion for years, she said. He often copied lines for her on the backs of envelopes. I asked whether she remembered any of them. She smiled, that same composed, distant smile, and replied, "He preferred writing to speaking. Words behaved better on paper." I said I knew the feeling. She offered me tea as before, but this time her hands trembled slightly as she poured. I asked whether her husband had ever written poetry of his own. A faint flush touched her cheeks. Surprise, amusement, or warning, I couldn't tell. She said that he had once, long ago before marriage, before the faculty dinners and the academic politics. He said it embarrassed him, those early verses. He destroyed them all. Her tone suggested the relief of one who had seen the bonfire herself. As she spoke, my eyes drifted toward the mantel. The same owl-shaped paperweight rested there, though the letter beneath it was gone. In its place lay a slip of cream paper, folded once deliberately. I caught a glimpse of a line written in a woman's hand. "The mercy we refuse becomes our punishment." A quotation, perhaps, or an echo. Later that night, back in my rooms, I opened the Greek anthology again. Between 2 pages I found a small pressed flower, faded, scentless. Beneath it, in faint pencil, was another note. E.C., 1978. Evelyn Crichton. I felt a small tightening in the chest. Not jealousy, exactly, but the sense that I had trespassed into someone else's unfinished sentence. The next morning, I took the book to the Bodleian, to Fiona Clare. She examined it with the air of someone reacquainted with a ghost. She told me the volume had once belonged to her department's lending collection. Crichton had borrowed it years ago and never returned it. He said it read differently in his own house, she said. I didn't argue. I asked whether she recognized the altered translation. Her lips parted, then closed again. Finally she said, "That line was mine. He changed it. It took me a moment to understand." She had written an article on those same elegies, "Love Conceals What Truth Reveals," published a decade earlier. Crichton's private copy had corrected her version into its opposite. I thanked her, though she seemed not to hear. Her eyes lingered on the open page as though seeing her own erasure staring back. Outside, the rain had returned. Slow, ceremonial. I walked along Broad Street thinking about misdirection, how often the truth hides not in invention, but in version. The poem's alteration, the reversed meaning, the subtle rewriting of one soul by another. A marriage, perhaps, could survive on that principle, but not forever. At home, the crossword waited. One clue read, "Line altered to hide intent." 7 letters. The answer came at once. Revision. I smiled, though it felt less like triumph than confession. That night I dreamed of pages turning themselves, of ink shifting as if alive. The next morning the book lay open on my desk, though I was certain I had closed it. The verse stared back, patient, immutable. Truth lies beneath affection. I sometimes think that was Lionel's epitaph, written long before his death, a scholar's self-deception disguised as scholarship, a lover's denial preserved as philology. The poem had been his mirror, and in correcting it, he'd only corrected himself out of sight. There are evenings when Oxford seems to fold in on itself, when the lamps blur in rain, and the city forgets its cleverness long enough to feel human again. That night at the Randolph was one of them. The air outside smelled faintly of wet wool and cigarette ash, the sort of scent that clings to regret. I had not intended to see Fiona Clare again, but investigations, like old habits, are rarely guided by intention. I told myself it was professional. A quiet dinner, a few questions. She had agreed easily, too easily perhaps, as though she had been expecting me. I arrived early, as I often do when I'm uncertain whether I should have come at all, The bar was dim, full of that muffled clinking that comes only from hotel glassware and middle-aged diplomacy. Fiona sat near the window, her coat draped neatly over the chair, a glass of white already half finished. She greeted me with the sort of smile that makes memory feel like complicity. I remember the way she said my name. Soft, unpunctuated, as if testing whether it still held weight. We spoke, at first, of trivialities. The weather, the term's end, the tedious cycle of committees that governed university life. Then, inevitably, of Lionel Crichton. She called him Lionel without hesitation, though the intimacy in her voice was carefully rationed. I asked whether she missed him. She replied that she missed the arguments more than the man. Over the rim of her glass, she said something that has never left me. He used to say that truth bored him, that only interpretation kept him alive. I asked whether she thought that was true. She looked down at the table and said quietly, "It depends who's doing the interpreting." The waiter arrived, interrupting whatever silence might have followed. We ordered the same dish, lamb, rare, though I doubt either of us tasted it. Between us, the candlelight trembled like a secret trying to remain unsaid. I found myself studying her hands again. They were steady this time, almost unnaturally so. I asked about Evelyn. She said they had known each other years before. A seminar, a shared supervision. Then, as if correcting herself, she added, "We admired the same man differently." I didn't ask which man she meant. Some answers are less informative than the pauses that follow them. After dessert, she mentioned that Lionel had been frightened before he died. Not of death, that would have been too ordinary for him, but of exposure. He said something about being undone by kindness, she recalled. I never knew what he meant. I did not tell her that the phrase appeared in one of the notes found on his desk, written in that same careful script. The mercy we refuse becomes our punishment. It was not a confession, not exactly. More a closing argument in a debate no one else had attended. When Fiona rose to leave, she offered her hand in that distant European way, polite but final. I watched her step into the rain, umbrella opening like a black wing. For a moment, her reflection lingered in the restaurant window, doubled by the glass, and I thought of Evelyn standing before the florist's shop that afternoon, her own reflection beside her. Two women, each carrying the same burden under different names. I stayed a while longer, finishing my whiskey. The crossword in the evening paper was still folded on the bar. The final clue read, "One deceived by clarity, 8 letters." I tried a few possibilities before settling on glassman, a term I'd never seen used but which felt oddly right. A man deceived by what he sees too clearly. Perhaps that was Lionel's failing. Or mine. As I left, the waiter passed me the bill, his name badge catching the light. Julian. It was such an ordinary name, yet the sound of it unsettled me. I asked, almost casually, whether he had worked there long. He said he had transferred recently, after an illness. Heart trouble, he explained, as if apologizing for surviving it. His eyes flicked toward the window where Fiona's shadow had been. For a moment, recognition passed between us, unspoken but certain. Outside, Oxford shimmered under the rain, every reflection slightly distorted, every truth half seen. I walked back toward Beaumont Street, thinking of that line from the poem, "Truth lies beneath affection." I began to suspect that both women had read it differently, and that somewhere between their versions lay a motive. When I reached my rooms, the city was silent, but for the faint echo of church bells through mist. I poured a final drink and stared at my notes. The evening at the Randolph had given me nothing concrete, only gestures, half-phrases, a coincidence of names. Yet I knew, with the tired certainty that comes to men like me, that the case had quietly turned a corner, not through revelation, but recognition. The moment one realizes that everyone, sooner or later, sits down to dinner with their own reflection. It was Lewis who found the note about the inscription. He handed me the photocopy as though it were a scrap of debris rescued from a storm. The heading read, "Translation disputed, St. Giles's plaque." Beneath it, Lionel Crichton's handwriting in small, meticulous lines. Rest eternal crossed through once, replaced by rest betrayed. The amendment seemed trivial to him, perhaps, but to me it was the kind of correction that rewrites the dead. I visited St. Giles that afternoon, walking slowly beneath the dripping trees. The church stood half-hidden behind iron railings, its tower wrapped in scaffolding like an unfinished thought. Inside, the air smelled of damp hymn books and the faint sweetness of brass polish. A curate was arranging flowers at the altar, white lilies, too pure for human intention. He nodded politely when I entered, mistaking curiosity for faith. The plaque was near the vestry door, a modest marble rectangle bearing a Latin inscription from the 18th century. Requiem aeternam dona ai Domine. But the older layer of carving, barely visible beneath the restoration, carried a variant. Requiem deceptam. Betrayed rest. The difference of a single word, yet I felt its pulse through the stone. I traced the letters with my gloved hand. The chisel marks were shallow, deliberate, not vandalism, but amendment. It occurred to me that Evelyn's handwriting, in her note to the coroner, carried the same angular pressure on the downstrokes. A coincidence, perhaps, or a signature too subtle for ink. The curate approached, asking whether I was interested in ecclesiastical history. I told him I was interested only in human ones. He smiled uneasily and said the plaque had been restored 10 years ago under the supervision of Professor Crichton himself. The funding, he added, had come from a private donation, the widow's maiden trust, if I remembered correctly. I left without answering. Outside, the rain had thickened to mist. I stood beneath the portico, watching water gather in the grooves of the stone, filling each letter as though language itself could drown. Back at the station, I asked Lewis to check the church's restoration files. They showed Evelyn Crichton as project treasurer and her husband as consultant translator, a domestic collaboration carved into eternity. Yet something about it unsettled me, the choice of words, the tone of correction. Rest betrayed. A phrase both theological and personal. That evening I walked to the Randolph again, not for drink, but for silence. The lobby pianist was playing something plaintive, uncertain, the melody losing its way in the middle register. I sat in the corner with my notebook, thinking of that phrase, of Evelyn's calm voice repeating that Lionel had died quietly at home. Quietly. Yes, but perhaps not peacefully. On the next page of my notes I wrote, Latin inscription, change deliberate, motive emotional, not academic. I drew a line beneath it and stared at the ink until it blurred. In my pocket, I carried the day's crossword. One clue remained unsolved. Faith altered, finds betrayal. 7. I had been puzzling over it all morning. Now the answer came unbidden. Convert. It pleased me for a moment, then felt hollow. Change is rarely faith. More often it is exhaustion disguised as conviction. Later that night I returned to St. Giles. The verger had left the side door unlocked for the plasterers, and the only light came from the votive candles trembling near the aisle. I stood again before the plaque. Betrayed rest. The stone caught the candlelight unevenly, revealing the faint grain of recarving, the trace of human insistence against time. I thought of Lionel, hunched over drafts, rewriting a translation to hide an earlier sin, or of Evelyn standing behind him, correcting what he dared not admit aloud. I stayed there longer than I meant to. The silence of the church was not peace but anticipation. Somewhere in the dark, A drop of water fell from the ceiling, a slow echo through the nave. I felt the weight of all the misread words, the poet's alteration, the widow's smile, the scholar's silence, aligning themselves into a pattern still just beyond comprehension. When I left, the night air was cold enough to make me shiver. Oxford lay quiet under the fog, each street lamp haloed in its own small confession. I paused beneath one and wrote a final note to myself. Rest betrayed, not by death, but by translation. Even now, when I pass St. Giles and hear the bell marking the hour, I think of that inscription, the way one word replaced another as easily as truth replaced mercy. It was late afternoon when Lewis told me Julian Merrow had come forward. The kind of hour when the light turns indecisive, neither day nor night, the color of truth diluted by hesitation. He stood in my doorway, shifting slightly, as if reluctant to disturb something delicate. He said Merrow had confessed. I asked to what, though I already knew it wouldn't be enough. We met in one of the small interview rooms at the station, those pale, airless places that smell faintly of disinfectant and memory. Merrow sat across from me, thinner than I remembered from the photograph. The years had made him apologetic in posture, not in expression. His eyes, a scholar's eyes once, were restless, scanning corners, seeking some invisible audience for his remorse. He said he had gone to see Lionel Crichton that night, not to harm him, only to explain. He had plagiarized one of Crichton's translations, a youthful arrogance he had tried to bury in academic exile. He had returned to Oxford to beg forgiveness, to end what he called a long humiliation. He found Crichton drinking, bitter, half-dressed, the room smelling of claret and failure. He said the professor shouted at him, then clutched his chest, collapsed. He panicked, fled. The end of the story was tidy, too tidy. I let him speak without interruption. When he finished, I poured him a glass of water and watched how his hand trembled. Not guilt, I thought. Fear of the wrong kind. He asked if it would make a difference that he hadn't meant any harm. I told him intention was a dangerous currency. It loses value the moment it's spent. He looked away, muttering that Evelyn had told him it would come to this. It was the first time he had mentioned her. I asked in what context. He hesitated, then said she had visited him in hospital 2 weeks earlier, while he was recovering from an operation. He thought she wanted to help him. She had spoken of forgiveness, of endings. He said her kindness had frightened him. When he left, Lewis said it sounded like closure. I told him closure is a word invented by those who can't bear loose ends. He frowned, said we had enough to file the report. I didn't answer. That evening, I went to the Crichtons' house once more. The curtains were drawn, though the lamps inside burned low. Evelyn received me with a politeness so immaculate, it felt rehearsed. I told her about Merrow's confession. She nodded, as if she'd been waiting to hear the performance reviewed. She said she hoped it would bring peace. I asked whose. She did not reply. Instead, she poured tea, the ritual unbroken, the motions almost liturgical. As she handed me the cup, I noticed the faint scent of disinfectant on her skin, the kind used in hospitals. She saw my glance, withdrew her hand too quickly, a gesture small enough to hide within manners, yet too sharp to ignore. I asked whether she had seen Merrow recently. Her eyes, steady until then, flickered, a brief betrayal of calm. She said she had gone once at Lionel's request to settle an old debt. When I asked what kind of debt, she said only that forgiveness requires a witness. When I returned home, the confession lay open on my desk, its words as precise as Crichton's own scholarship. I read it twice, then again, hearing in its phrasing an echo of someone else. The line about the mercy we refuse becoming our punishment. The same phrase from the note beneath her paperweight. The same rhythm, the same quiet resignation. The handwriting might differ, but the author was the same kind of mind. I took up the day's crossword. A distraction, or so I told myself. The clue that stared back read, "Admission that conceals another truth, 510. The answer came slowly, almost painfully. False confession. The air outside had grown colder. Rain pressed against the window with the same insistence as thought. I poured another measure of whiskey and let the glass rest untouched beside me. The facts aligned neatly now. Too neatly. Evelyn's visit, the borrowed phrases, the calm acceptance of a guilt that wasn't hers to bear. Or perhaps it was, in some quieter sense. In my notebook, I wrote a single line. Confession dictated by affection, not conscience. Then I crossed it out. There are certain deductions one prefers not to articulate. Truths that demand preservation through silence. When I finally turned off the light, I saw her face again, the widow's poise, the faint tremor beneath it, the mind that had edited grief as carefully as she once corrected her husband's work. Somewhere between them the real crime lay buried. Not murder, perhaps, but mercy misunderstood. And I thought, as I often have, that some lies are told not to deceive others, but to spare them the unbearable accuracy of truth. It was late when I returned to her. St. Giles was half drowned in mist, its lamplight trembling like a secret no one wished to tell. The church stood closed and quiet, the bell tower dark against the sky. I'd walked there without purpose, or so I told myself, but in truth I had nowhere else to go. The case had ended in all but name. The files were clean, the reports aligned. Yet something remained. Not a fact, but a feeling which Oxford teaches you is the more dangerous of the two. Evelyn Crichton opened the door herself. No surprise in her eyes, only the weariness of someone who has been waiting long enough to mistake endurance for calm. She asked whether it was over. I said yes, though I wasn't sure what it was anymore. She stepped aside, and I followed her into the sitting room, that immaculate still life of order and silence. Nothing in the house seemed changed, and yet everything had been erased. She offered tea again, and I declined. She poured herself a cup anyway, her movements slow and deliberate. It struck me that she moved like someone measuring time rather than living in it. The clock on the mantel ticked with a precision that mocked us both. I told her Julian Merrow's confession had been accepted. The inquest was to close without further inquiry. She nodded once, as if acknowledging the final line of a play whose ending she already knew. I asked whether she believed him. She said quietly that belief was a luxury for those who hadn't lived with truth. For a long while, we said nothing. I watched her stir the tea, though she never drank it. The spoon moved in small, perfect circles, as if rehearsing control. Then she looked up at me and said, "You think I killed him?" It wasn't a question. I told her I didn't know, that there were many ways to kill. Omission among them. She smiled faintly, not with pride or guilt, but relief. She said Lionel had been ill for months, though he would not admit it, that he feared humiliation more than pain. He had spoken of finishing his work, of leaving things tidy. She had tried to help him, not by saving his life, but by saving his dignity. Her voice was steady, almost detached. He was dying already, she said. I only made sure he did not die alone. There are moments when confession sounds less like guilt and more like grammar, the inevitable correction of a sentence written wrong. I asked her whether she understood what she was admitting. She said she had understood long before I arrived. Then, more softly, "I don't expect absolution, Inspector. Only comprehension." Outside, the rain began again, faint but insistent. It tapped against the window like a question that would never find its answer. I told her I wouldn't file a statement, that there was nothing to prove, nothing to disprove. She thanked me with a nod, though there was no gratitude in it. only exhaustion. As I stood to leave, my eyes fell on the marble owl upon her mantel, the same paperweight that had once pinned the letter Lionel never sent, its wings spread wide, frozen in that gesture between vigilance and flight. Beneath it lay a folded sheet of music, Adagio in G minor. I asked if Lionel had played. She said no, but he had liked to listen when the world grew too sharp. I took my coat and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet stone and night flowers. Somewhere beyond the fog, the bell of St. Giles began to toll, a slow, uneven rhythm as though the metal itself had grown weary of announcing the obvious. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl upward, vanishing before it reached the dark. Back in my rooms later, I poured a whiskey I didn't drink and stared at the crossword. The final clue waited untouched. Mercy mistaken for crime. 7 letters. The answer eluded me for longer than it should have. When it came, I wrote it down without satisfaction. Pardon. Years have passed since then, and yet her face remains. That stillness, that careful grace. I sometimes pass St. Giles on winter evenings and hear the bell echo through the rain. I think of her words, the gentleness with which she confessed to ending a life that was already leaving. Some truths, I've learned, arrive too late for justice. They belong to that quiet space between sin and sympathy, where intention bleeds into mercy, and the difference ceases to matter.